This is a presentation of the University of Wisconsin-Parkside.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am Tom Racine. I do a podcast called Tall Tale Radio, and I am the moderator for the Kenosha Festival of Cartooning. Welcome to the Kenosha Festival of Cartooning. We hope you have a wonderful time getting to know the cartoonists who are here and who are behind your favorite comics and comic characters. I need to take some time to thank some of our partners for this evening's events: the University of Wisconsin-Parkside Art Galleries, the UW-P Library, the Kenosha News, and the National Cartoonist Society Foundation. Special thanks to the additional sponsors of tonight's catering: Kevin Wolf and Mary Gao, Robert and Frances Hybert, and the Johnny Hart Studios for the catering. An enormous thank you to Denis Kitchen, who will be talking in a second, for providing all of the art in the Fine Art Gallery show. Thank you to Tim Hamilton for his work on Fahrenheit 451 hanging in the Mathis Gallery. Thanks to the KUSD teachers and John Hambrock, who work with the students, artists, whose work is hanging also in the Mathis Gallery. And thanks to Glenn Larson for his tireless work in hanging these shows. Thanks to the gallery director, Amy Misarelli Sorensen, for dedicating all three galleries to comic art and graphic narrative. And be sure to check out the Underground Comics exhibit, which is in the Foundation Gallery down the hall. Personally, I would like to thank, for all the artists as well, Ann Hambrock, who is right there, for organizing the entire festival. I was here 2 years ago, and it was amazing. I'm very, very proud to be back, and it's an amazing event, and I hope it continues every year, and you slowly go crazy because of that. So, in addition to this evening's program, we have a number of events at the Kenosha Public Museum on Friday and Saturday, as well as another knockout show of original comic art on display in the museum's East Gallery. Check your programs for full information on all our events. And speaking of programs, if you are planning to attend the other events, please hang on to your program because our supply is limited. And also, don't forget to ask the artist for signatures and drawings on the back, like Greg Craven's right there. He will sign your thing right there. We left space on there just for that. And while you're here in Kenosha, please take a moment to check out the fine businesses downtown, and all within walking distance of the museum. And finally, she has asked me to read a proclamation from Mayor Bosman for the festival. So this is the official proclamation. Whereas the Kenosha Festival of Cartooning is a 3-day event featuring nationally and internationally recognized cartoonists and will be held at the Kenosha Public Museum and the University of Wisconsin-Parkside. And whereas there will be live presentations, panel discussions, original art, slideshows, meet and greet receptions, and workshops offered during the festival. And whereas guest speakers include Jeff Keane of the Family Circus, Denis Kitchen of Kitchen Sink Press, Lincoln Purse of Big Nate, Rick Stromoski of Soup to Nuts, Todd Clark of Lola, Scott Stantis of Prickly City, Terry Liebenson of the Pajama Diaries, Michael Schumacher, author of Al Cap, A Life to the Contrary, Tim Hamilton of the graphic novel version of Fahrenheit 451, Paul Buell, comic historian, Tom Racine, Tall Tale Radio, and George Hagenauer, comic historian and collector. And whereas there will be gallery shows of original cartoon art on display to the public free of charge at the Kenosha Public Museum and the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, and whereas there will be outreach presentations by the cartoonists to students in the KUSD School District, and whereas the support of our community, along with the generous grant from the National Cartoonist Society Foundation, has allowed the festival organizers to provide all of the above, whilst having not to charge admission for the festival. And now, therefore, I, Keith G. Bosman, Mayor of the City of Kenosha, Wisconsin, do hereby proclaim September 25th through the 27th, 2014, as the Kenosha Festival of Cartooning, as the official proclamation. And without further ado, I take great pleasure in announcing and introducing to you Mr. Denis Kitchen.
Thank you, Tom. Is this working? Yeah? It's great to be back in Wisconsin. I was born in Milwaukee. I lived most of my life here. Recently been in Massachusetts, but it's great to be back in Packerland and Cheeseland, and I appreciate the turnout tonight. I'm supposed to have a clicker. Maybe it's over here. So it all began, this is a picture of me in high school. And I started with it because I met a lot of students today, and there are a lot of students that came up to me today who are aspiring artists. And I wanted them to know that it's never too early to start professionally. And you may not get paid, but there are things you can do to make a name for yourself, to get experience, and more important, to get feedback from contemporaries, teachers. This was a contest we had at Horlick High School in Racine to decorate homeroom doors with a Christmas theme. And, you know, pretty much it's predictable what people do. That's kind of blurry, but I'll interpret it. At the top, it says, peace on earth, goodwill to men. Under the tree are all kinds of submachine guns and rifles and pistols. So I was 14 then, and it was just kind of instinctive. I found out later it's called satire. At the time, probably it just seemed like a wiseacre thing to do. But it got laughs from classmates, and it got, you know, furrowed brows from teachers, and so it was worth it. And so I built from there. We had, these in focus, it doesn't look focused to me. Yeah. We had an assignment as sophomores. We had to do a paper on the profession you're going to be. I knew early on I wanted to be a cartoonist. But the assignment was you had to pick 2 or 3 choices. You had to interview somebody in that profession. Had a lot of pressure from my family. I had a very successful, in our family, electrical engineer who became the kind of the role model that was forced on me. And I didn't really want to be an electrical engineer, but the paper basically was required that you interview someone, and I could not find a cartoonist, you know, in a 100-mile radius of Racine. So I interviewed my cousin, who was an electrical engineer, and began asking him these kind of routine questions about what it was like so I could write this paper. And as I was interviewing him, he was in the backyard of his suburban home, tending to a beautiful garden. As he looked at me at one point and he said, "You don't really want to be an electrical engineer, do you, Dennis?" And I said, "No, not really, George." And he said, "If I had it all over to do again, I wouldn't be an engineer, I'd be a gardener." And he said, "Follow your heart." And that was liberating to me because no other grown-up had said that was okay. So it saved me from 4 horrible years in engineering school. And so at that point, I was absolutely determined nothing was going to stop me. And I started a paper in high school called Klepto. And when I say paper, it was mimeographed, had some color, as you can see. And it basically was satire about kids in the school, teachers, mostly topical things. Had a gossip column that was very popular. In fact, I'm confident most people bought it for the gossip column, not the wonderful cartoons and satire. But the important thing was it was experience. And every time I did one, I had more self-confidence. I also was able to use the school's materials and sell them for a nickel. So circulation, I got up to 300. $15 was a lot of money. In the mid-'60s in Racine, Wisconsin. Oh, these are out of order. Anyway, even on term papers, I didn't just hand in a term paper, I illustrated them. So you can see this one's dated. Will the Braves win a pennant in 1963? No, they did not. But what I tried to do every time, even if it didn't always make the teacher give me a better grade, was put that extra cartooning into any assignment I had. And it worked well in every class except art. I found out early on, at least in those days, art teachers hated cartooning. They looked down on it, and every time I had an assignment, in fact, there's a classmate, Sharon, in here who had the same teacher I had, and every time he gave us an assignment, I tried to interpret it in a cartooning form, and drove him crazy, and he drove me crazy, and he gave me an F. which is the only time I ever had an F, ironically, in art. But the truth is I wasn't following the assignments, and I realized, maybe I was pushing a little bit too much. But I was unrestrainable when it came to my love of comics. And this is a Robert Crumb cartoon. I'll bet this happened to you when you were a boy. Almost every other mother that we know threw away their son's comic book collection and or his baseball card collection. It's just what mothers did. I bet if we polled the guys in this audience, at least of a certain age, they would absolutely say, yeah, my mother did that. It was just par for the course. I trained my mother early on when she said she was going to toss my comics. I negotiated with her that if I would keep my room neat, she would allow me to keep my comics and trading cards and whatever else. So it taught me to be neat, taught me to be organized, and I was the only kid in like my entire neighborhood who still has his comic books. It also was an important lesson in negotiating, which came to be important when I began to be professionally publishing. Like other kids, the comics that I read were newsstand comics: Superman, Batman, Little Lulu, Richie Rich, Uncle Scrooge, you name it. I read them all. It was voracious. But up in the upper right-hand corner of all these comics was this thing, the Comic Code Authority, which as a kid I didn't really know what it meant, but it really was the comics industry in order to protect itself from a lot of attack from psychiatrists and PTA groups and so on. The comics industry tried to clean up its act by basically creating a self-censoring board. And what it did was it sucked a lot of the energy out of comics, and a lot of the scary horror comics and the creepy detective and mystery comics and Crime Does Not Pay and EC comics, they all became emasculated. And as a kid, I didn't understand the politics behind it. I just knew that comics were not as entertaining as they were. And thankfully, there was one exception, and that was Mad, which started as a comic book. Harvey Kurtzman was a genius behind it, and 4 or 5 regular contributing artists, and it was brilliant. Came out in 1952 as a comic book. By 1955 or 56, it converted to a magazine. And it was a breath of fresh air in a culture that was really pretty repressed. I grew up in, Eisenhower era. Everything was very white bread, and it was post-McCarthy era. There wasn't a lot of dissent, at least in the world that I saw. But Mad was, as one critic put it, was a submachine gun attack on American culture, in a good way. It pointed out the phoniness in advertising and in every aspect of culture, politics, you name it, and it loved to also parody other comic strips, which was great, because that just wasn't done before. And Harvey Kurtzman was probably my first inspiration, because, and I'm not alone, my whole generation, and not only me, there were stand-up comedians and writers, all kinds of people who ended up in entertainment who were deeply influenced by it. I was also, as you may know, of an age that I was part of the, call it the counterculture, the hippie generation. Nothing to be ashamed of course. And we all have embarrassing hippie photos. This is my most embarrassing one. I think I must have been inspired by either Fu Manchu or the villain in Flash Gordon. I'm escaping at the moment. Yes, thank you. And but aside from looks, because every generation, if you were a punk, you've got embarrassing photos. Hipsters will be embarrassed in a few years. The point is, what my generation was about, in many ways, was freedom of expression, and anti-establishment stance. And one of the things I did as an artist when I lived on the east side of Milwaukee, I'd paint on anything. This was the stairwell up my apartment on the east side, and of course I didn't own the building, but I felt I had a right to paint the hallways, My landlord eventually came and painted over all of this, including the inside of the house, the ceilings, you name it. Was very upset with me because he said it took 4 coats of paint to cover the walls. I also painted cars. I had a 1950 Nash, which some of you will know was proudly manufactured in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I loved 1950 Nashes. It was called the bathtub model. I spent an entire summer painting this with enamel, I think 14 colors of enamel. Never quite finished it, and you can't see it here, but this was a big, round, pretty high car, and people of normal height couldn't see the roof, but on the roof there's a topless mermaid, which only truck drivers and bus drivers could see. And I also owned a hearse at the time, 1954 Cadillac hearse, and it broke down one time, and I had to call my dad to rescue me, and my mother had the family car, so he had to rescue me in this. And he drove like a little old lady down, so no one he knew would recognize him driving a hippie car, which would have been mortifying. But so I loved expressing myself in every way that I could, in every medium. And about the time I was getting out of college, part of the Cultural Revolution, it included underground newspapers, which some of you know about, but underground comics broke onto the scene in 1967. This is Robert Crumb. This is the watershed moment in this aspect of comics history. Crumb was a brilliant guy, still is, who has a totally unrestrained sense of humor, no restrictions on his id. And Zap was, the subtitle I think says, the comic that plugs you in. And I remember when I saw that, it was just a mind blower. And I was at the same time working on a comic that I didn't realize was an underground comic, but it soon became part of this, because I was at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and we had a humor magazine I co-founded called Snide. And Snide was a place for young writers, cartoonists, photographers to reveal their work. And I inherited it after the first issue, and I was supposed to have an $800 treasury, which is our profit from the first issue, and that was going to be an all comic book issue. The former editor disappeared with the $800, and so basically I was, well, that's me and Crumb, by the way, that one's out of order. I published myself, Mom's Homemade Comics #1. And the title might seem kind of dumb and awfully, in fact, wholesome for an underground comic, but the whole title was a setup for the subtitle. Maybe you can read it, Straight from the Kitchen to You. So I always figured if you have kind of a crazy name like Kitchen, you know, take advantage of it. This is an example of the kind of, because underground comics are considered by some people, you know, on the pornographic side, but this is just an example of, it says, hello friend, this here magazine is an underground comic book. Of course it ain't no smutty book what uses F***CK and P***CK*, etc., or other nasty words. It's just hard-biting satire type magazine what tackles controversial subjects like the war with an asterisk and Vietnam asterisk. So you can see the point of it really was nobody in comics, certainly not newsstand comics or newspapers comics, are really talking about the war in Vietnam. To me and to my generation, that was the obscenity. And that there was occasional nudity, profanity, whatever, that was not the point. We were trying to inject some honesty. We thought, like just about everyone in my generation thought the previous generation was too uptight, was too hypocritical, etc. And that's a recurring thing. But for us, it was very obvious. It was because we had long hair and beards, and women wore granny dresses, and we had a very distinctive look about ourselves that set us apart in a way that most generations aren't so easily identifiable. And there was a cohesiveness that was held together in part by what I would call the burning issues of the day, because besides the war in Vietnam, we thought, you know, we need to legalize pot. That might happen in our lifetime. We were certainly caught up in the civil rights was an ongoing thing. Women's rights were burgeoning. Gay rights were just beginning. There were all these issues that unified us. And so basically comic books, this is me taking Mom straight out of the oven, again, literal. I found a group of fellow cartoonists, mostly in Milwaukee, some in Chicago. This is a jam where we each drew ourselves. That's me in the upper left, and the back row is Don Glassford, who, in fact, might as well use this. That's Don Glassford. Jim Mitchell, who's in the audience tonight. Skip Williamson was a Chicagoan. Jay Lynch was Chicago. That was Bruce Walters and Wendell Pugh, also Milwaukeean. So it was a movement that was beginning to happen all across the country. San Francisco was the epicenter of it. And let's face it, every hippie who could would move to San Francisco because that was a very hip and beautiful place to be. I chose, and my comrades chose, to stay in Milwaukee for mostly practical reasons. The rent was cheaper. But there was actually a burgeoning activity here, and in fact, you'll notice there were more underground cartoonists in Milwaukee than Chicago, because that's the total census at that time. And we distributed our books not through normal newsstands, because they wouldn't touch us, but through head shops. And head shops, you probably know, a place where you buy your pipes, your bongs, your Dayglow posters, your beads, and of course, your comic books. And we knew it was not something we had to, ever say. It was obvious that the customers who were buying these are probably taking them home, getting stoned. There also was a lot of pass-along, because these went to dorm rooms, to hippie pads, where a lot of people were sharing the same space. So the readership on these things was incalculable. And we had, well, this is the name of the company. When I said, you have a name like Kitchen, what do you do with it? So Kitchen Sink Press became the name of it, and the faucet was the trademark. Early on, when I became more and more involved in the business, I was pretty good at it, but I really wanted to be a cartoonist. So I was constantly struggling with myself. So this is my kind of recurring two-headed self-portrait. Here I am fighting with myself about deadlines and so on, because I kept thinking, well, I hope the business does poorly, it'll go out of business, I can just draw full-time, but it didn't, it kept growing. And you get employees, you get more titles, you get more responsibilities, there's less and less time to draw. But I remained an artist at heart. And here's a page early on that I did that's impossible to read, so maybe it's easier to see one panel at a time. So this is me in a suit and tie, of course, saying, you may think that being the head of an underground publishing company is a lot of fun. Well, let me tell you, it's not. Phone rings. It's a supreme hassle is what it is. Excuse me, ring. Hello, Hef, how you doing, baby? Tonight? Listen, why don't you come here? Sure, bring a lot of girls. Yeah, later. And then, like I was saying, it ain't a barrel of monkeys. For instance, I have to slip out of my comfortable suit into these bell-bottom jeans because some cartoonist is coming in with a new underground comic book. And of course, I'm buzzed that he's here. And this is a caricature of Robert Crumb. So hey, what's happening? Got a new book here. Groovy. Can I get an advance? Well, times are tough, but I'll tell you what, here's a 20 out of my own pocket. Dennis, you're a saint. So then I tell Miss Cheever to bring the limo around, wire money to the Swiss account. I change back into my comfortable suit and tie, and meet Hef, and we hang out with the babes. And that's the way life was running Kitchen Sink Press, or at least that's the tongue-in-cheek version that I enjoy doing, because the truth is, it was a hassle. This is probably the comic that'll be in my epitaph. Kind of inspired by cheesy monster movies, and the cover of Fantastic Four #1, where there's a creature bursting through the sidewalk. This was done the day after I took some particularly nice acid, and this idea came to me, and I jotted it down as a notebook, as I often did, and put it in my shirt pocket. And typically the next day, after being in an altered state, the ideas were sometimes incomprehensible. But this one, I thought this one's still good, so I ran with it. And this was probably the best-selling comic I ever personally did. I also, in terms of themes, the general sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of sums up the generation, and it sort of sums up the kinds of things we published. So you saw one example of a kind of a sexy title, or at least a parody of sex. And drugs, we did a series called Dope Comics, and again, that's not a subtle title. When you buy Dope Comics, you know what you're getting. The difference is, and this was a series that ran quite a few issues, and it was a chance for artists to talk about their experiences with drugs. So it wasn't necessarily a hit you over the head to use drugs. It was artists saying, hey, here's the experience I had, and maybe you should think twice before you eat belladonna, things like that. This particular cover, again, it's drawn in kind of the artist who did this, Leslie Cabarga, did it in the style of the Fleischer Brother cartoons from the 30s, if it looks recognizable. So it's bugs, the villain is like the spider forcing a joint on this poor guy in a barber chair. And I probably should have brought that original to the show because it's got a little secret image in it. The artist sold me the original in advance, and so he knew when I was getting it that I would be keeping it. He did it in an animation style. If any of you know anything about animation, you have clear cells, you paint the reverse behind it, and then the background is often done in like an airbrush technique or whatever. So the bugs and the title were on an overlay, and it was taped along the side, and it had a note on that said, please do not remove the tape. And then further in the note it said, don't remove the tape. And at the very end it said, well, if you have to remove the tape, be very careful. So I knew there was something going on. I lifted the tape carefully, and underneath the barber chair, there's a little sign sitting in the chair that only I will see, and it says, Denis Kitchen is a faggot. And that's the kind of stuff we used to do to each other, stuff that you wouldn't see in publication, but little in-jokes between cartoonists. This is one, again, I don't know if it's readable from back there, but this is my contribution to one of the Dope Comics, where it says, the values of grass are many and varied. It is perhaps most useful as an inspirational tool. Some of my best ideas have come to me under the influence of the drug. So there I am saying, oh wow, I just got an idea for the greatest comic in the history of civilization, Western civilization. As soon as I come down, I'm going to knock it out. But marijuana is also known worldwide as a potent aphrodisiac. Flick out the lights, mon petit, it's time for l'amour. It's only fair to sustain you. One joint will sustain me for 48 hours. So again, it's having fun with something where there are a lot of myths about drugs. My idea to deal with it was tongue-in-cheek, always. When I said sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the rock and roll part actually involved us doing some comics that were rock involved. In this case, this was actually an authorized comic that lasted 8 or 9 issues from the band itself. So I got to hang around a little bit with rock stars now and then. That's me and Jerry. I led a cleaner life. I'm still here. Robert Crumb, some of you may know, probably the most important, most influential of the underground cartoonists. Mr. Natural was one of his most famous characters. That's one of the titles we published. That's a humor anthology I love doing. This is Crumb and not necessarily typical of an innovative science dealing with the energy issue with the most efficient possible car. I also had the pleasure of publishing Will Eisner, someone who was a giant in the field of comics, who was actually, though a generation older, very impressed with the underground scene in the sense that it provided the kind of freedom he never had when he was working for publishers in the 40s and 50s. He also loved the fact that underground comics creators got to keep their own art, own their own copyright, and then no editorial restrictions, all of which were very appealing to a guy like him who was a great cartoonist and also a terrific businessman. So I ended up doing quite a bit of work with Eisner over the years. That's a portrait of us meeting that I did. Obviously, we're a little bit different. As Will said later, Dennis and I both smoke pipes, but with different substances. Art Spiegelman, someone you may know from Maus, the Pulitzer-winning graphic novel. When he was starving and unknown, he did a lot of comics with us too. And Snarf was an anthology, so it featured short pieces by people that sometimes were well-known, and it was a chance for me to give opportunities for newcomers, because it's tough to break in. You know, how do you break into any field if you're not known? Well, an anthology is a good way to do it. This was another Snarf cover by Will Elder, who some of you may know was a longtime collaborator of Harvey Kurtzman. Those of you in the field here who know your art history will recognize that's also a parody of Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, but it's his basically saying this is the end of hippiedom, because he has all of us clinging to a raft, starving and near death. Humor. I finally did a spin-off of Snarf called Mondo Snarfo, deliberately surrealistic, or at least surrealism as we define in comic terms. I've always been a big fan of the surrealism movement, and it was an influence on me in ways that might be hard to decipher in comics world, but I did, this was an album cover that also served a double purpose in Mondo Snarfo. My brother was in a band, and he asked me if I would do the cover, and I said sure. And then 90 hours later, I was like cursing, but I ended up doing this, and the guy who was the guy who ran the band was a little full of himself, and my brother was annoyed that he got all the attention. So I said, "Don't worry, I'll put your name on the cover." So in the background, amidst all of this detail, the letters of his name are floating in the background. So I gave him a grid with holes cut in it that he could put over it, and his name was on the cover. So again, little in jokes. If you're in the gallery and you look at the actual art, it's a lot of little things. If you linger over a panel instead of just going on quickly, you might find a lot of little hidden things like that. This is an example of my strip in Mondo Snarfo. So it looks like a comic strip, but there's no words, there's no real apparent continuity. It's basically just a stream of consciousness, me doing one panel at a time, having no idea what will come next, just having fun with it. And it's some of the favorite stuff I did. Of course, it didn't sell as well as other comics because it didn't really have any punchlines. It was more of a philosophical experiment, but no regrets. And everyone else who was in it had fun too. But it showed how we could stretch the medium. Because it was my company, I knew it probably wouldn't make money, but I didn't care. Just wanted to do it, and that was part of the beauty of it. Seldom in a position where you can be that experimental and not have to worry whether it was profitable or not. In 1973, we had a thing called the crash of '73. A couple of combinations occurred. First, the undergrounds started coming out in the late 60s, and we sold them on a non-returnable basis. So a lot of head shops, they'd fill their racks, they'd reorder, fill the racks, but certain ones just would never sell, and they got kind of dog-eared, and nobody in those days knew what a remainder table was, so they would basically be concerned about ordering more comics because the racks were full of old ones. The other problem was the Supreme Court passed a ruling on obscenity that threw it back into local communities for definition, and that really scared the bejesus out of a lot of head shops that we relied on for a network because they were already in kind of an outlaw status. A lot of them were marginal members of their retail community, and so they were afraid that if they carried undergrounds, they would get busted for carrying obscene material. So we had a lot of shops dropping out. Around that time, Stan Lee, who ran Marvel Comics and some of you may know as the creator of Spider-Man and Captain America and Iron Man and others that are now big movies, much bigger than the comics. He had been on trying to hire me for one reason or another, and the crash of '73 was such. I had 2 babies and a wife and rent, and I decided now's the time to be pragmatic. So we came up with an idea for a magazine called Comics Book, Comics with an X. And the idea was that Stan would give underground cartoonists a platform, and we would get distributed on newsstands like real magazines, and they would pay us real money, 4 or 5 times what we were making ourselves. And I was able to cajole out of him a number of concessions, including letting us keep our art and our copyright and things that they'd never given before to artists. And so it was so innovative and so out of touch with reality that he had to pull a plug on it, because other people who worked for Marvel understandably said, why are you giving these long-haired guys these breaks and not us? So it's kind of a Pandora's box situation, and so he quit the magazine, and he couldn't quite put it all back in the box, because the point is that artists, all creators, you want to own what you create. You want to get your art back. You want to be paid fairly. You want to have all the things a book author would typically have. But cartoonists traditionally didn't get those, at least at that point in time. This was kind of a groundwater publication in that it, for the first time, a major publisher did make concessions. And it's never quite been the same since, although there were gradual changes. Even now, the big companies are much more fair with creators. So it was nice to be part of that experiment. That's me and Stan. That's a toupee on the guy on the right, by the way. Stan was bald since the 40s, but he always wore a toupee. This is one of the pieces in the gallery show. Working for Geektown was really working for Marvel. We also put out a horror series called Death Rattle, which I was especially proud of. This is Charles Burns, who some of you may know for Blood Club and Black Hole and some graphic novels that have hit the mainstream. I especially like this one because back in those days we used X-Acto knives, which now are pretty much obsolete in the digital age, but it's little demons cutting the ear off the artist with an X-Acto knife. Some of you may have heard of Frank Miller, Sin City and 300 and Dark Knight and so forth. Early in his career he did a Death Rattle cover, but he insisted on using silver ink, and it's like 5 colors, that's expensive, but it was Frank Miller, so okay. Bringing it back to a Wisconsin theme, this is a special issue we did on the famous Ed Gein, who basically is saying stop and have some victuals as he's ladling some stew out of a human skull. I don't know if today, you know, people talk about Ed Gein much anymore, but back when we did this, he was still very big in the culture, and this is one of our best sellers. So everyone was morbidly curious, and Dave Schreiner wrote the article, longtime editor at Kitchen Sink, and it's a terrific summary of what really happened in 1957 in Plainsville, Wisconsin. Also tried to give forum to women who, when I began, the few women in the industry. It was totally dominated by men. The companies were owned by men, the editors were men, the artists were men, everybody. You very, very rarely see women in the industry. And so the underground movement, because a lot of the feminists were also cartoonists. Trina's Women is one of the titles we gave to Trina, who was probably the foremost of the women cartoonists. Then there were many others. Also, some of them thought some of the titles like Bizarre Sex or things by Crumb and S. Clay Wilson and others were terribly sexist. And so I had a meeting with some of them, and I said, look, you don't object to eroticism per se, you just think they're doing it in a crude or misogynistic way. And they said, yes. So I said, then do your own title, your own erotic title from your perspective. And so Wet Satin is what came out of it. And there you see Trina, I think, is ogling a young Marlon Brando. And then gay comics was another one where there was a minority that didn't have a voice in comics, and I decided they should. This is a cover by Rand Holmes, which I love because the character on the left is literally not out of the closet yet. This is one, the original is also in the exhibit next door. Basically, Steve Krupp, the bald guy on the right, is one of my recurring, probably only recurring character. He's kind of a alter ego as a publisher, and he's a villain typically in stories, or he plays God in the 5 Minutes with God story. And so here he is basically representing corporate America, trying to force nuclear energy and fossil fuels, coal, et cetera, down the little baby who's the environmentalist who's kicking it all away. And this was back in 1980, so it was early on. I also did a thing for the state of Wisconsin, which came about in an unusual way. I was sitting at Hooligan's Bar on the east side of Milwaukee one time, talking comics with a friend, and a guy in a suit next to me in the bar asked me what I did, and I told him, and it turned out he was the Assistant Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin. And he said they were putting out these boring pamphlets for kids on consumer education, and would we consider doing a comic book, something they'd actually read? So I said, all right, that sounds interesting. We got a grant, and we put this together, and it was given away free to all high school seniors, teaching them what it means to legally become an adult, what it means to sign a contract, scams that are aimed at young kids, that sort of thing. So it was an interesting, for me, the first time dealing with the government and actually doing something for the educational system and using educational comics in a literal way. It even got reprinted in other states, but it started right here. I moved to Princeton, Wisconsin in 1973, and I took over an old functioning farm, basically remodeled the barn, and that became our offices. So we were off the beaten path about as much as you can expect. And so I became kind of a gentleman farmer while still publishing, and this is a little strip about that, which I'll show you panel by panel. That was my actual address, number 2 Swamp Road. In fact, Mike Gold is in the audience, once asked me, Dennis, is there a number 1 Swamp Road? No, there was not. So another day begins. So I've got an artist here, and he says, that's not all. I got to have more. This royalty isn't enough. After all, I've got a name. So I'm thinking to myself, this guy doesn't look so tough. So I grab him by the neck, of course, and say, listen, you'll take what I give you, and you'll like it. And he assents. And basically, a typical day, toward noon, I'm begging a printer to print a book I've been waiting for 6 months ago. I'm screaming at people who owe us money. And basically, you can see the in pile way outweighs the out. And outside my window, there's a bird flying, and I'm complaining things aren't simple anymore. Simple, yeah, I used to have flowers in my hair, put out 2 books a year when I felt like it, ate brown rice, grew veggies. I'm going for a walk, smell the roses. So I decided to go out in the woods, and I basically end up negotiating with a squirrel. So again, it's making fun of myself. I love being in the country. I love publishing. I really wanted to be a cartoonist. So that was a way to combine all three. The Bugle, meanwhile, I hit the switch. There we go. The Bugle was a paper started in 1970 that ran for 7 years. Started in Madison, and then it was Milwaukee, Madison. And I ended up doing a lot of the covers. I was a co-founder, and we had an entire page of comic strips that local artists did. It was the only underground paper in the country that had its own comic section, and they got syndicated or, as we sometimes said, ripped off by other papers, because kind of the hippie rule was you could just reprint anything you wanted from other alternative papers, which was, kind of cool in one way, but was not a way for us to pay the rent making comic strips. So the Bugle was probably one of the few papers also that, well, I shouldn't say only one, but it went, this was our 5th anniversary. It lasted 7 years, which is long for an underground paper. And again, always tweaking fun. There's a cop over on the right who's lighting a joint with one of the candles. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. But it wasn't always a great time with an underground paper, because we obviously pissed somebody off really bad, and they literally firebombed our building that was on North Bremen Street in Milwaukee. I had just literally an hour before that, I was working in the building drawing a logo for a new music column called Plastic Donuts. And that was one of the few things that actually survived. You can see it with the smoke and water stains. They never found out who did it. There were a lot of suspects, but it just showed that, you know, we use the word underground press loosely, but sometimes when you're underground and you're doing articles about people who are powerful and the tactical squad in Milwaukee and the American Nazi Party and people like that, you make some enemies, and some of them don't play fair. This is one I did for Monty Beauchamp's Blab magazine called The Square Publisher, where again I'm pretty much making fun of myself. A page for Blab Monty. I'm a publisher. I don't draw anymore. Can't. Blab is an edge mag. My edgy days are over. I get panel fright. The light bulb doesn't light up anymore. I'm allergic to ink now. Did I mention that? I can't even think at the office. It's a zoo. Monty, you're just going to have to get a real artist. And that shows me with unsavory corporate types. And the chart up there is how to take over the comics industry. So, again, it's having fun with the fact that I love drawing. Didn't have as much time to draw as I'd like. And so I'm an easy target. Just to bring it back, locally again, as I mentioned, I think earlier, I went to Racine Horlick High School. Every time they have a reunion, every 10 years or so, I do the cover for it. This was the 10th reunion, when it was kind of unusual that the class president on the left was a hippie, and you know, some people were balding prematurely and were pregnant, and by the time we got to the 40th anniversary, it became age humor. So classmates who were fashion trendsetters 40 years ago were still turning heads. Right. Crosstown rivals die hard. Park High School was our crosstown rival, some of you may know. So we toilet papered Park last night, stole their mascot. Awesome, go Rebels. I forgot what the mascot was. Apparently they were Panthers. I remembered it as being some mangy goat. So. But the point was still taken. A few of our star jocks may have slowed down just a little bit, and you know, she says, I can still do a mile in 5 days. Turned out our key star was in a wheelchair. It's kind of embarrassing, really, because I had no idea. He showed up, and this is the cover. No respect from the cartoonist. But 4 decades later, the class of '64 can still party hardy. Bartender, Metamucil on the rocks. 3 Viagra. Get me a prune juice. Make it a double. And this is the one literally last week. This is the last thing I drew. We had our 50th anniversary. So again, with walkers and canes, the class of '64 still rocks. And then this is the last image, which I will leave up here because Michael Schumacher and I, after, I guess, a little Q&A, will be the next panel. And we'll be talking about the very fascinating El Cap, if you stick around for that. So thanks for showing up. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer. Okay, quick 10 minutes and then the panel. Anybody? Right here? I never ran